Well, good morning. Finally. Me up or this down? So, anyway, well, welcome again to Old Fashioned Sunday School 10.0. No, actually, it's this is year 17. So, all good, all good. Started in a little room up there with no mics needed. Moved down to the old bookstore, then moved back up here. A lot of things have changed. I've gotten older, wiser, hanging out with George. And this summer I asked Amy to marry me, and she did say yes. So. So, 17 years of that and 16 of this. So anyway, we're good. We're good. Anyway, welcome, and I'll turn it over to George quickly.
Good morning. I am glad to be here. I hope you are glad to be here. Realize that we also have folks online. So as we stream this, we will have a community that expands beyond these walls. The spiritual community that we built during the pandemic will continue, notwithstanding our being able to gather in person. I want to open with a line from Scripture that will be familiar to those of you who listen to morning prayer, because you've probably heard this many times. It comes from the 4th chapter of John. But the hour is coming, and now is, when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. For such the Father seeks to worship him. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth. We are continuing our study of Mark. We covered the first half of Mark before the summer, and we're now picking up at the beginning of the second half, which is a second call to discipleship. So while I've got some things to say about that second call, I want to open with a continuation of a theme that has been emerging in our conversations. And I'm going to do that by going back to what I hope will be a familiar sound and experience.
What keys are in, Robbie? F demented.
Pulled into Nazareth, I was feeling about half past dead. Just need some place where I could lay my head. Hey, mister, can you tell me where a man might find a bed? He just grinned and shook my hand. No, was all he said. Take a load off Fanny. Take a load for free. Take a load off Fanny. Put the load right on me.
I picked up my bags, went looking for a place to hide. When I saw old Tom and the devil walking side by side, say, hey, come on, let's go downtown. She said, I gotta go, but my friend can stick around. Take a load off Fanny. Take a load for free. Take a load off Fanny.
Put the load right on me.
river, son. Won't you stay and keep Annie company? Yeah. Take a load off Annie. Take a load for free. Take a load off Annie. Put the load right on me. Crazy Chester followed me, and he caught me in the fog. He said, I will fix your rack if you'll take Jack, my dog. I said, wait a minute, Chester, no, I'm a peaceful man. He said, that's okay, boy, won't you feed him when you can? Take a load off Daddy. Put the load right on me.
Catch a cannonball now to take me down the line. My bag is sinking low, and I do believe it's time to get back to Miss Fanny. You know she's the only one who sent me here with her regard for everyone. Yeah.
Take a load off Fanny. Take a load for free. Take a load off Fanny. Right on me.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
Which I first learned about when I was a freshman in high school, maybe. My grandfather gave me the album because he loved them. So this song has always held a special meaning for me. We've talked about the song, The Weight, in terms of the burden of trying to do the right thing. The burden of trying to do the right thing. And that's the theme we're going to explore this morning as we begin the second part of Mark, the second call to discipleship. I'm going to start with the gospel passage, or at least part of it, that we read this morning in church. So I want to do kind of a Lectio Divina exercise with that passage. I'm going to read it 3 times. The first time, I just want you to listen to it. The second time, I want you to see if there are any word or phrase in it that stands out to you, that shimmers, that seems to have a little bit more energy. And then the third time, I want you to focus on one of those things and see what you learn about it. Here we go. Jesus went on with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi, and on the way he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" And they answered him, "John the Baptist, and others, Elijah, and still others, one of the prophets." He asked them, "But who do you say that I am?" Peter answered him, "You are the Messiah." and he sternly ordered them not to tell anyone about him. He called the crowd with his disciples and said to them, "If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who want to lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it. For what will it profit them to gain the whole world and forfeit their life? And indeed, what can they give in return for their life? Those who are ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of them the Son of Man will also be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels." On this reading, I want you to see if anything stands out to you, has a particular energy. Jesus went on with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi, and on the way, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" And they answered him, "John the Baptist, and others Elijah, and still others one of the prophets." He asked them, "But who do you say that I am?" Peter answered him, "You are the Messiah." And he sternly ordered them not to tell anyone about him. He called the crowd with his disciples and said to them, "If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it. For what will it profit them to gain the whole world and forfeit their life? Indeed, what can they give in return for their life? Those who are ashamed of me and of my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of them the Son of Man will also be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father, the holy angels." Try to pick out one word or short phrase that stood out to you in that reading. And when it comes to you, if you'd like to share that with us, please do. Don't wait for me to call on you, just say the word or phrase. Don't tell anybody about him. Lose your life to save it. Messiah. Ashamed. Class dismissed, yeah. Right. Yeah. What can they give in return for their life? Anything else? You can say the same thing someone else has already said. Yeah. Yeah, so is there one word or phrase? Is it Messiah? Messiah? What's the one word or phrase? I'm having trouble hearing through the mask. Anointed, thank you. Perfect. Yes, thank you. Anointed. Sally. You. Good, yeah. Take up your cross, yeah. Excellent observation. Did everyone hear that? Saying we're referencing cross. We immediately know what that means, we think, but it hadn't happened yet. So what do they think it means when they hear it? Right? Yeah. What else? This is a rich passage, I think. Okay. Well, having heard those words that shimmered for others, let's read the passage one more time and see if it takes on any different meaning for you. Jesus went on with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi, and on the way he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" And they answered him, "John the Baptist, and others Elijah, and still others one of the prophets." He asked them, "But who do you say that I am?" Peter answered, "You are the Messiah." And he sternly ordered them not to tell anyone about him. He called the crowd with his disciples and said to them, "If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it. For what will it profit them to gain the whole world and forfeit their life? Indeed, what can they give in return for their life? Those who are ashamed of me and of my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of them the Son of Man will also be ashamed when he comes to the glory of his Father with the holy angels." All right. So I'm going to approach this passage by going to what I think is the fundamental question, and then I'm going to try to incorporate the words and phrases that you felt connected to as we began to explore the answers to this question, because all of them, I think, are actually extremely important and relevant to your answer to this question, right? Your answer to this question. Who do you say that I am? Now, many of you will recognize this picture of Jesus because it's the one National Geographic constructed based on their archaeological evidence. I love it because it challenges me. It's so different from the Italian Jesus that I prefer. It's so far from my image in the mirror that it strikes me as perhaps being real. Who do you say that I am? We get, or I'm going to cover this morning, 3 different answers to this question. The first is Peter's answer. Peter, of course, says, and we kind of assume it must have been with an exclamation point, "You are the Christ." And you can almost imagine Peter sitting back in excitement because he knows he has the right answer. And yet Jesus silences him. Why? Well, we don't know exactly why, of course, but one thing to note is that Christ, or Messiah, had a meaning to the people in Jesus' time. Messiah in the first century for the Jews was the return of the military hero, the triumphant member of royalty who was going to restore the kingdom, who was going to bring the empire back under the guidance of God. Read, get the Romans out of here, and maybe deal with the corrupt Jews who have been enabling the Roman rulers and oppressors. This is a very clear meaning. Is that what Peter meant? I don't know. Is that what Jesus is reacting to? Maybe, because of course, just following that, Jesus begins to explain what this means, what Christ means, what anointed one means, what Messiah means. And Peter doesn't like it at all. And they silence each other until Jesus finally moves on. So that's one answer. You're the Christ. But it's not an answer that Jesus seems comfortable with, at least not yet, because, as Mac noted, he tells them not to talk about that. Why does he say that? The second answer comes from Chad Myers. We have been using Myers's commentary, Binding of the Strong Man, to explore Mark. Myers's perspective in his commentary is that Mark is a very political gospel. And when I say political, I mean politics. It is about challenging the powers that be in society, about external behavior. It's about challenging the religious authorities, challenging the military authorities, challenging the political authorities. And we've spent time in studying the first half of the gospel, exploring how that's true and what the political connotations are for each and everything Jesus did. But what's interesting about Myers's take on the answer to this question is that Myers goes back to Daniel, to the prophet Daniel, which is apocalyptic literature. Now, apocalyptic in this sense means it's a way of talking in code in order to comment on what is going on then. It's not just a foretelling of the future. It's a highly symbolized way of making political commentary on what's actually going on. So it's written 200 years before Jesus and Mark, and it's actually supposed and offered as encouragement for the Jews who were being persecuted at that time. In the 7th chapter of Daniel, there's this mystical court scene where Daniel sees 4 beasts kind of coming out and then going before the court of the Ancient One and the angels, the heavenly throne, and they are all judged, and out of that comes the Son of Man, who is given glory. The translation for that Myers uses is the Holy One, the human one, which I like. A, it avoids some of the gender issues, but B, it really speaks to the humanity of the chosen. So it is out of Daniel and the scene in the court that Myers answers the question, who is Christ to you? And this gets too ashamed, because what Myers says is that you're speaking on 2 levels at the same time. For the Jews who were going into the court and being persecuted, that's happening in real time. This apocalyptic literature is encouragement to them because it says this is not all of it. Real is in another dimension. Real is in a heavenly dimension. Real is yet another court in which you are being vindicated by the human one. And so don't think that the pain and suffering you're experiencing now at the hands of these oppressors is the end of it all, because you are being acquitted in the other court. Which is why I think when you get to that line in the gospel, the human one is the defendant on the one hand and seems to be the persecutor on the other, where somebody is ashamed because of the posture they've taken in one court, but the other posture holds forth in the other, right? So what Daniel is saying is, look at this other dimension, look at this heavenly dimension, in order to see the presence of God through the presence of the human one. And he uses that as the context to interpret Jesus and what Jesus would have meant to the folks at that time, right? It is another myth. And the myth he is using out of Daniel, he is using to supplant the myth of the Messiah that Peter is using. In the myth of the Messiah that Peter is using, there is a triumphant entrance into Jerusalem where the military powers are overthrown and the corrupt religious authorities are overthrown and the corrupt political folks are overthrown and the oppressive economic order is overthrown and the kingdom of heaven emerges. And what Myers is claiming is that Jesus says that this is going to happen through the Christ, but it's not going to look like what you thought. It's not the myth of redemptive violence. It's not that God is going to give us the armor to overtake the oppressor through force. It's going to happen in another way. There's a nonviolent way that this Messiah is going to rule. You are the human one. The interesting thing to me about Myers' explanation is that it's highly political and it's all about external behavior. So at some point, those of you who've looked at the commentary, he gets kind of caught up in what this means for the interior life, specifically with deny yourselves and pick up your cross. And it gets all bobbled, I think, because it doesn't really fit. And I'm going to talk more about why that's true. But at least this answer, drawing on Daniel, focuses on the political aspects of this movement, of this Messiah. And it seems undeniable to me that there is a political aspect to it. The cross is a highly political symbol. The cross was used to execute criminals, usually of lower class. And it was a symbol that while Christ hadn't been executed on the cross yet, a lot of other Jews had. In fact, there was a rebellion maybe 30 years before where the roads were said to be lined with crosses on which the rebels hung. So many that they ran out of wood and had to import more. It was humiliating. And that's why the Romans used it. To see a naked body in pain hung up at the corner of an intersection or at the scene of a crime was to show the power of the Romans and to humiliate the individual that became their victim. So while Jesus hadn't been on a cross yet, the cross had a lot of meaning at that point. So what does Jesus mean when he says, deny yourselves and pick up your cross and follow me? And Myers says, it means challenge power. That's what it means. It means you, as a follower of Christ, have a duty and obligation to challenge the powers that are resisting, providing obstacles to, preventing the coming of the kingdom, of justice. And that's where Myers kind of stops right there. I want to offer you a third way to think about this passage. And it comes from Cynthia Bourgeault. We've talked about it before. And what Bourgeault says is Jesus, who is Jesus to Bourgeault? Bourgeault says Jesus is a master of the wisdom tradition, which is an ancient tradition about human transformation, the transformation of consciousness, which is at the headwaters of the great rivers of every spiritual tradition that we can think of, right? It is something like that which is behind Buddhism or Hinduism or Islam, particularly the contemplative, mystical portions of those traditions. And Bourgeault says it is also at the headwaters of Christianity. Jesus is a master wisdom teacher. Now, what does that mean, transformation of consciousness? Bourgeault gives us a, I think, helpful example when she talks about a computer program. She talks about a computer program that comes installed in our operating system as being a dualistic program that with great efficiency separates everything from everything else. So we know what is white and what is black, what is in and what is out, what is tall and what is short. That's how we think through the recognition and application of those differences. And I've talked about this as being the consequence of eating the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. That what Adam and Eve actually gained in that was the ability to see differences. I got this insight from Godly Play. So you know it's right. So it's not that that is bad necessarily. You know, the other interpretation of that event is that it's pride and rejection of God and the fall that leads to the great problem Jesus has to overcome. But think of it in this way. It's knowledge that is helpful and efficient and leads to a lot of what we've done in the world, the advances of civilization, and yet on its own it's inadequate. because it is constantly separating us from each other. It is constantly creating borders and boundaries that we have difficulty overcoming, which is part of why I love that rendition of The Weight, right? As we go all around the world and see people in all these different means of dress and instruments in which they're playing, and yet they are connected through that music. They can hear the voice of God, I would argue, in that song and realize they are connected with each other, so that the smiles on their faces look to me like the joy of a life in God as represented by the music. So Bourgeault is claiming that we have this operating system. The transformation is to transform out of this dualistic way of looking at the world into a unitive way of looking at the world, which is to say, see how things are connected. See, and you do that, I think, by changing your perspective. You do that by not standing apart from everything, treating it like it's an object to be analyzed, segregating one thing from another so you'll gain more control over it, sifting through everything to get to one final concrete answer. Instead, you take the perspective that it's all connected. And how can you see the largeness of that? How can you see those connections? How can you nurture them? Right? So I was talking to Lyons earlier about Psalm 46, verse 10. Be still and know that I am God, a prayer that we've talked about in here. Why is that so valuable as a spiritual exercise? It is, I think, because stillness, quieting our own minds, that active thinking, worrying, judging mind, allows us to get more deeply into ourselves. And in that emptiness, there seems to be an aliveness, a voice, if we learn how to hear it, that is God. Be still and know that I am God. Be still and know that I am. Be still. The way we work that transformation of consciousness that Bourgeault was describing is through learning how to be stillness, getting out of the way. Or as I tend to think about it, getting smaller so that there's room for God. When I'm really big, there's no room for God in my life, right? And we get smaller in a whole lot of ways. The dean preached an excellent sermon this morning. If you hadn't heard it, you'll look forward to hearing it. One of the examples that really resonated with me was being in traffic and having all these things be in your way and letting someone pass in front of you and having them say thank you and feeling great, right? For me, that experience is getting small. When somebody has cut me off, when somebody is inhibiting my progress, when somebody is delaying my trip, I tend to get bigger out of anger, out of annoyance, out of frustration, but I get bigger and I can see less. And it is shocking to me how one little gesture of kindness, one thanks was what she said, allows me to get smaller, include another person, realize the relationships I'm in. While that's a pedestrian example, at least for me, it's a powerful one because that is the movement between a dualistic perspective and a unitive perspective, between me and everything in my way and us and how we've worked it out. Do you see the difference in that one very kind of ironic to call it pedestrian? She was actually a runner, but whatever. Small yet meaningful example from everyday life that highlights this transformation of consciousness. When we only talk about it as transforming our consciousness, it can seem like too big and too far away and unattainable. But it is through our spiritual practices, it is through creating room in ourselves for God's presence that we come to feel more like that moment when we got the thanks and that moment when we were angry because the gap in traffic didn't appear. I think we could have a whole class on the spirituality of traffic, I think. Right? I've never had to say I'm sorry more than when I get home from being in Atlanta traffic. All right, so what's going on? Bourgeault makes the remarkable, I think, observation that when Jesus asks the question, who do you say that I am? By the way, I want to say, Sally, that you is also the word that many people use for that presence of God that they feel in contemplative prayer. You, which is interesting, right? So anyway, what Bourgeot says is, it's not that Jesus is putting the disciples through some kind of test or exam to evaluate their knowledge. Can they give the right answer? That's not what that's about at all. It is instead about what part of the disciples recognizes Jesus, the Christ, the presence of God. What part? You might argue that the part of Peter, if he's thinking about a traditional myth of redemptive violence in saying, you are the Messiah, the Christ, the part of Peter that is recognizing Jesus or wanting to recognize Jesus is not the deeper part. It's the dualistic part, not the unitive part, right? That if you think about all of the times that Jesus encounters people who need healing, people who are looking for some presence of God, how often their lives are changed simply by their encounter with Jesus. Why is that? Why is that? To get at that, Bourgeot asked a question, again of us. Would it make any difference to you if Jesus had not been executed and not been crucified and not been resurrected? Would that change your faith in Christ? And how you understand Jesus, how you answer this question? So I'll pose that to you. If Jesus had never been put on the cross and never been resurrected and there was no ascension, would you believe in Jesus, the Christ? Excuse me? What would he be? Exactly. Excellent. Yes. What would he be?
He would be just another Jesus.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. I think many of us feel exactly that way. Absent those things which we know about, we wouldn't be talking about Jesus. But back to your point, when these people changed, this hadn't happened yet. They weren't looking and saying, oh, he's the one that's resurrected. He must be God. It was something about their interaction with him that changed their lives. It was something about his authority, not as the scribes, remember? There was something about that said, I'm leaving the family fishing business and following this itinerant preacher.
But yet, he was incarnate when he was born.
Yes?
Usually people are not
Usually people are not incarnate.
by the Virgin Mary.
Well, I'll give you the Virgin Mary part. My mother is wonderful, but she wasn't the Virgin Mary. But one understanding of the incarnation is that there's a presence of God in everything. Not only every person, which is hard enough, but every part of the created world. So Bourgeot, one time, tongue-in-cheek, she's an Episcopal priest, somebody said, do you really believe what you said in your ordination, that the scriptures contain everything necessary for salvation? Because it seems like you've gone pretty far afield with this wisdom stuff. And she said, absolutely, I believe that. I believed it then, and I believe it now. And they took a deep breath and relaxed. And then she said, I also believe it's all in a rock. I believe everything necessary for salvation is in a rock. Now, that is not to contrast a rock with Scripture, but it is to point that out. Yes?
I think I don't have an answer for the question, but I do have an observation. And what I think about it is Jesus' mom. He's going to go home. We're trying to put the story of the crucifixion and this, and we're trying to. You once said that in the Bible, God are all too difficult to understand, and we think we can understand it, but it's beyond our comprehension.
Yeah. No, thank you. Thank you. So to kind of summarize, the idea that we've talked about is Christ, God, is a mystery. We can never fully understand it. It's beyond our comprehension. We can't experience it. We can't experience the love of God. Mac.
I tend to look at it as the Hollywood moment in Ben-Hur when Jesus gives Charlton Heston some water and he looks into his eyes and he knows immediately. And so I think back then people around him probably.
Oh, I love that example. I love that example, the Charlton Heston moment. Yeah, when they're looking at each other in their eyes and suddenly the connection is obvious and the presence and energy and power is obvious. Which, going back to the Dean's example, there was that moment in the way he described it too. There was a moment where the runner, if you're a runner, you know about this, right? You don't cross an intersection without seeing in the eyes of the driver. And so the Dean described this moment where they're looking at each other. So yeah, I think the energy is right there. That's the energy of the event. Yes, sir. He always smiles when he says that. Have you noticed that? This may be heretical. He's like, I hope it is. I hope it is. Yeah. Yeah, I hate to say this to you, but I think that's exactly right. Right, because it's not an exam. It's not as if here's the answer, blah, blah, blah. It's written in the scriptures. It's actually an experience. It's here is what I see. Here is what I recognize. And Jesus for me now is not what Jesus was for me when I was 15 or frankly yesterday, right? Because my experience of the love of God allows me to grow, or to take my earlier image, the times I've been able to get smaller allows me to recognize the presence of God, and it's easier for me to get smaller the next time. And so we're constantly growing in our appreciation of God, and ultimately I believe the question and the answer are not in words. Because language, as wonderful as it is really another way that dualistic mind works. Right? The meaning of a word is that it's not another word. The dualism is inherent in the way we use language, which is why it's so amazingly effective and helpful. But ultimately, when people start to describe the presence of God, their language looks kind of ridiculous. And who knows what Teresa of Avila is saying until you've had that experience. Because you can't get there through the words. You can only get there through the experience. I took our 9-year-old to the batting cage yesterday, and I'm trying to work with him on how to hit the ball, and I'm like, I'm giving him these words. They're not helping. And then I see somebody over there swinging exactly right, and I said, well, watch him. And he got that right away. But I like to talk, so that's a problem. But yes, to all of that, and I think that's what Bourgeois was saying. Christ is a recognition event. And what we do in church is constantly create space for those moments to occur. And what we do in our relationships when we're healthy is constantly, and sometimes when we're not, is constantly create space for those moments to occur, where we recognize the energy of God, of Christ, and we're able to grow in aligning ourselves with it and acting out of it. So the problem I've got with Myers' construct of it's just about going and challenging the powers is that you can do that without any transformation of consciousness, right? You can do that with your ego absolutely fully intact. Your self-righteousness at full bore. Becoming a martyr does not necessarily demand humility. Or you go to Galatians 5 and think about the fruits of the Spirit. You don't have to have any of that to challenge the powers. And in fact, sometimes they get in the way. So are we called to challenge oppressive powers of political and economic and military and religious systems? Yes, of course. But we're called first, I think, to challenge them out of a different place. To challenge them with the perspective of looking at the world in a unified way. A perspective of looking at the world through the eyes of God, as we've come to understand that because of Christ. And that will change, I think, how you protest, how you work change, and what you even think about it. And hopefully makes you less kind of demonizing. So, for example, if you're challenging these powers in your mind by concluding that the people who are exercising that power are less than human, then you haven't changed anything at all, except who's on top if you win. Does that make sense? It's not changing the way power is used. It's only changing who's using it. That'd be from a dualistic perspective, not from a transformed consciousness. So I think Myers is onto some valuable things, and I think it's helpful to recover the political aspect of all of this, as difficult as that is. But I don't think he goes as far as Bourgeot does, which is more helpful to me in terms of living my life in God. Because it matters where I come from. So in Myers' estimation then, what you have to do to be a disciple is to deny yourself, pick up your cross, and follow Jesus. And cross is a very political symbol, and martyrdom is the ultimate result. But Bourgeot focuses on a different part of that sentence. She's focusing on the explanation for what that means. Right after that sentence, Marx says, lose your life to gain your life. And these other kind of paradoxical things. What does that mean? Well, in Bourgeot's construct, what that means is letting go of the ego, small, self-absorbed self, right? And instead, allowing your true self to emerge. Or to put it in more psychological terms, letting go of the attachments that you've used to identify who you are, what people say about you, or what you've achieved, or what you possess, even if virtue is what you're possessing, right? To let go of those as your markers of identity and instead be a child of God. Be able to respond out of compassion and humility and joy at the awe of the presence of God that you encounter. Right? That's the task. And I think Myers leaves that out when he's talking about following Christ. But I think if you deny yourself and take up your cross, clearly take up your cross is not get through the day, bear the burdens of whatever personality traits you wish you didn't have, or whatever burden somebody else has put on you. That's not what take up your cross means. It means change who you are, lose the identity that you're rooted in now and become somebody different. And it might mean be a martyr. But we each have our own ways of expressing the presence of God in our lives, and that's not the only way. All right. I want to close with something else. So before I transition, any question about that? Yes.
got here to remember at the same time what is happening on a different plane in God, trying to remain in God, coming from that place, not from the place of looking and being absorbed in everything that's happening or trying to find an answer, trying to find what's going on, but remembering to live from that place in God. And that, to me, seeing that again brings hope. Because if you have this heavy despair all the time, that's hard. And sharing that with her, she said, I need to read whatever it is you're reading. I need something. She said, I've got to have that hope back. It's like she had to have some kind of light in there. And that, to me, as we're going through all of this, keeping those things on there, like there is a different level to be able to give from, rather than just the physical impact or the hammering against it.
Yeah, I think that's beautiful. No, I think it's beautiful. You can, and I hope you do, but getting back to our notion of recognition energy, I think the moment there was your mere presence, not just what you said. Had she read that in a book, it wouldn't have had the same impact on her, right? Which is why I think when we've overcome something in our lives, or at least suffered through something, our ability to be present to other people who are challenged by that same thing is much higher. Not because we've got an answer for them, but because we are a living testimony to hope and trust. I mean, I think the idea that God is present and active and loving is just something you have to trust to keep on going. And you're not going to always find evidence for it. And yet we have all these marvelous examples. Eddie Hillsman, for example, the Jewish writer in the concentration camps whose faith increased during that period of time. Or the Jesuit who wrote He Leadeth Me, who was up in Siberia in the gulags for 10 years, and his faith increased during that time. I don't know how they did that, but something about their trust and faith in God allowed them to see the life around them, help the life around them, and live. Yeah. All right. Any other questions? Lions. All right. So, back to this idea that it's not an exam, who is Jesus to you, who is Christ to you, for which there's a right answer that we have and the Baptists don't. Right? As much as I want that to be true, that's not it, I think. It is instead a spiritual practice that every time we encounter Christ, what do we see and what part of us sees it? What depth have we been able to plumb that we can now engage with Christ, who will transform it and let it grow? Right? We are ever working, doing what we do to gain higher ground. I want to close with that image for this transformation of consciousness that Bourgeois describes, of gaining higher ground, as if you're climbing the mountain and from that altitude seeing more. It's not just your village and the pathways around it that occupy your imagination from the top of the mountain. It's the whole valley. And in it, you just get a different sense of what's going on. To grow in faith is, in a way, to climb the mountain, to gain a different perspective. But words are not the best way to convey this, because as I've said, we can't fully understand the presence of God anyway, but we can experience it. And I think music is an amazing help in that regard. So here is the prophet, Stevie Wonder.
trying till I reach the highest ground.
Teachers, keep on teaching, and preachers, keep on preaching. World, keep on turning, 'cause it won't be too long. And lovers, keep on loving, and believers, keep on believing. Sleepers, just stop sleeping, 'cause it won't be too long. I'm so glad that he let me try it again. Last time on earth I lived the world of sin. I'm so glad that I know more than I knew then. I'm gonna keep on trying till I reach my highest ground. No one's gonna bring me down. Nobody, till I reach my highest ground. No one's gonna keep me down till I reach my highest ground. I said no one's gonna bring me down. No one's gonna, nobody,
Somebody feel good. Gonna bring them up with you all the way to the highest ground.
But the hour is coming, and now is, when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. For such the Father seeks to worship him. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth. Go in peace to love and serve the Lord.